Today's presentation is titled Cyber Breach, Preventing Bodily Injury and Property Damage. I'm Courtney Stevens, an attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Terry Dunlap, thank you for joining us. Terry spent over 5 years as an intelligence analyst, programmer, trainer, and speaker with the U.S. National Security Agency before starting Tactical Network Solutions in 2007. Back then, his company provided military units, the intelligence community, and law enforcement agencies the means to collect, analyze, and exploit data from embedded devices for actionable intelligence, as well as the ability to conduct low-profile computer network operations in high-risk or denied areas. Today, his company specializes in cyber risk mitigation of Internet of Things and other connected devices. Through meticulous examination of the heart and soul of IoT devices, firmware, Mr. Dunlap's company discovers hidden attack vectors that place IoT devices squarely into the crosshairs of hackers. Prior to his NSA experience, Mr. Dunlap held network security positions at Western Kentucky University and Deloitte & Touche. Prior to that, Mr. Dunlap worked at Fidelity Investments. He earned a Master of Science in Network Security from Capital College, now Capital Technology University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Economics from Case Western Reserve University. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Terry, who will begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Courtney. Appreciate that. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy day to attend this webinar. The few goals that I have here are very simple. The first goal is I want to make you aware of the issues, if you aren't already aware of the issues that are out there with IoT and connected devices, and specifically medical devices. Secondly, I want to make sure that when you leave, that you actually know how to find these hidden issues and attack vectors. And then I want to make sure that you know how to fix these issues if you happen to discover them in any of your products or any of your clients' products. And in the end, I want you to walk away with an action plan. So you'll know what to look for, how to identify them, or at least be aware of what to look for, how to identify them, and how to remediate them. So let me go ahead and get started. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I want to make sure we all understand the world that we live in today. So we see in the news all the time attacks, botnets, anything that's connected to the internet, primarily today being Internet of Things, connected medical devices, automobiles. I'm sure we're all familiar with the GPAC that took place a few years ago. These are making the news daily. The botnets are the biggest thing we need to concern ourselves with, because a lot of people, when I talk to clients, ask, why would somebody want to hack my MRI device, my MRI machine, sitting in the basement of a university hospital? And my answer to that is that they're not interested in the MRI device. They are interested in using that platform as a launching point for further attacks, whether it be attacks into the hospital to go after patient data information, or to use, in this example here, a botnet. So there's code freely available out there for any teenager in their parents' basement to go out, download this code, install it on their machine, and summons these IoT devices that have been hacked, and maybe take out Netflix, take out CNN, take out you name the website. So this stuff is happening. It's happening now, and it's happening on a regular basis. The one thing that disturbs me, and I don't know if you guys can see the actual date of these articles, but these articles were written about one of our guys who discovered security holes in internet-connected security cameras back in 2013. Back then, we would attend all these hacker conferences out in Las Vegas and demonstrate how this happens, what we look for, and how to use these devices to launch these types of attacks. So this has been happening for some time. This was back in 2013 we started making the industry and the community aware of the vulnerabilities. But nobody listened, and people still got sued. This is an actual case where a security camera maker ended up getting sued by the FTC because hackers were able to break into the cameras, steal the video feeds, and then send them to YouTube. And these were meant to be security cameras and in some cases baby monitors. So we were seeing on YouTube actual streams, live streams of people in their homes, around their property, because these security cameras got hacked. Now you can actually look this up. This is actually taken right off the Federal Trade Commission website. The company in question here, maybe you have one of these devices in your home, TrendNet. They not only make cameras, they make Wi-Fi routers and other routing and connected type equipment for home use. This is the part that I want you to be aware of. This is part of the settlement agreement, and I want you to read what's highlighted here in red, which is that TrendNet is required to obtain third-party assessments of its security programs every 2 years for the next 20 years. Now, if you want the government to get involved with your stuff, this is the way to do it. TrendNet has set the example. In most cases, TrendNet knew these problems existed, but yet they failed to address them until people started seeing their security feeds showing up on YouTube. They banded together, filed a class action lawsuit, FTC got involved, and this is the end result. But yet no one seems to listen. It's still happening today. IoT botnets are all over the place. And it's not just IoT devices. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of St. Jude. But in case you're not, let me quickly recap here for us, because this is a prime example of a large publicly traded company sticking their head in the sand until the government gets involved. TrendNet was the first shot over the bow. This is now the second. And this is going to be a wake-up call to connected medical device manufacturers that they need to be more proactive in what they do as opposed to avoiding these types of situations. Now, for those of you that know the St. Jude story, and for those of you that don't, after you hear this, I think you might agree with me that this might make for a good made-for-TV movie. So here's the story in a very short, truncated format. We basically have two players. We have St. Jude Medical Devices versus a hedge fund on Wall Street called Muddy Waters. So what ends up happening is that Muddy Waters ends up getting information on a security assessment that was done on St. Jude's implantable defibrillators. The security issue at hand was the fact that the device could be hacked remotely by an attacker or somebody who wants to cause harm. And there were two ways that the attack could take place. One, they could actually control the implantable defibrillator. That was one attack vector. The second attack vector was the ability to have the external monitoring device send enough data or query for enough data from the implantable defibrillator to actually drain the battery. So Carson Block, who is one of the members at Muddy Waters, the hedge fund on Wall Street, decides to take this information and take what's called a short position in the company's stock, which means if the stock goes down, the hedge fund will end up making money. So it's in his best interest to go on Fox Business Network, CNBC, Wall Street Journal, you name the outlet, and tout that St. Jude's implantable defibrillators are hackable and pose a serious health risk, if not imminent potential death to customers that have these devices in their bodies if this isn't fixed. So, of course, St. Jude stock drops as soon as the news is announced. Now, to put things in perspective quickly, that this actually took place last year in the fourth quarter. And for those of you that might not be able to see the date here, we're talking about late August of last year. So, Muddy Waters touts this research report that these devices are hackable. And as soon as Wall Street hears this, the stock drops. The stock dropped 8%. Now, that probably doesn't seem like a lot to you and me. 8%, yeah, big deal. But when you look at the market capitalization of St. Jude, which is around $5.6 billion, if I did my math correctly, I believe 8% of that would be right around $448 million in market valuation, market capitalization gone because of this report. I would think that Muddy Waters probably made their money that day, making that announcement. So it was enough of a hubbub that the FDA decides to get involved. Now, I don't know about you, I prefer less regulation in my life. Being a medical device manufacturer, I assume that you probably don't want a lot of government regulation interfering with your processes either. Well, this caught the attention of the FDA, so they decided to actually get involved and start taking a look at these allegations. Because right now at this point, it's basically he said, she said. But if you notice here, it was such a shock to to Wall Street that they actually halted the stock trading of St. Jude on that particular day. So what does St. Jude do in response? Well, of course they come out and say that it doesn't exist, it's bogus, the allegations are false, they have no proof, and so St. Jude decides to sue. So they decide to sue Muddy Waters for prancing around this libelous report that their devices are hackable and people could possibly die from this. So now we're into October, and there's no stopping these guys. So they're back to the airwaves, they're back to the blogs, they're back to the newspapers saying the vulnerabilities still exist. St. Jude has done absolutely nothing. We're sticking to our short position, and we're going to ride this stock as low as it'll go. So, of course, Muddy Waters decides to fight back over the lawsuit. So they file a countersuit. So this drags on to the end of the year. And the FDA is still kind of, prancing around the issue, doing their own kind of research and keeping kind of low at this point. But Muddy Waters, of course, ends up 2016 with a huge gain. I think it was maybe around 30% or so. The number could be wrong, but the bottom line is they actually did pretty well for this brand new hedge fund that just happened to appear on Wall Street with their very first big win against St. Jude Medical Devices. So, transition into this year. Now the FDA comes out and says, St. Jude, we've confirmed you can be hacked. So what happens? St. Jude finally admits it. Now, why they didn't come clean in the first place is beyond me. Maybe some of you in the audience may have people that are there that know connections, may have better explanations. But finally, the FDA puts pressure on St. Jude. They discover the flaw. They begin to issue patches. So what's the cost of something like this happening to you or to one of your clients' companies, possibly publicly traded? Maybe they're even a startup and they have some venture backing, and something like this were to hit the airways. What's the impact? Well, I mean, we already saw lawsuits flying back and forth. I quickly looked before I jumped on the webinar to see if any lawsuits have been filed against, class action lawsuits filed against St. Jude over the hackable defibrillators. And my quick search didn't reveal anything, but that doesn't mean they're not out there. Someone that has better legal resources than I do might be able to confirm that. So we're looking at fraud. We're looking at legal costs. We're actually looking at, if I can advance the slide here, I already mentioned that we had a stock decline in the neighborhood of 8% to the tune of almost $450 million. So there's definitely a financial impact there. And then what's the brand value that took a hit for St. Jude? There were some reports from some doctors that they are looking for alternate solutions to St. Jude, though I think their choices might be limited. But the trust value is now tarnished, and it's in jeopardy. Companies also suffer credit ratings. If they look to S&P and Moody's for credit ratings to secure long-term lines of credit or issue long-term debt, something like this is going to dramatically impact the rating that these agencies put on your company. Now, I didn't see anything in the news about executive shakeups, but if you look at what happened at Target because of a data breach, the CEO got ousted. And I'm sure there's other cases out there that the C-suite probably got shaken up pretty badly because of the cyber breaches. And then, of course, customers leave. I mean, you can't just rip an implantable defibrillator out of you and, call it quits with St. Jude. But, I mean, I think people are going to have second thoughts if they're aware of this issue of using this device if they need it. So what I want to talk about next is how do companies like ours and other pen testing companies out there discover these attack vectors? And more importantly, how can you, as a connected medical device manufacturer, look for these on your own if you have the team to do it? After speaking with a number of people in the know, it came to light that St. Jude didn't even develop the firmware that ran the implantable defibrillators in-house. It was actually an outsourced effort. And I'll get to why that could be a bad thing here down the road. So we need to figure out how to discover these attack vectors, what they look like, what tools we can use and give our development teams to utilize so they can discover them before you become somebody like a St. Jude or a TrendNet or another one of these companies where government interference is the rule of the day and there's all kinds of fines and lawsuits and whatnot. So at a high level, it's a three-step process. First of all, you have to take the firmware image that you are about to put onto your medical device. That the firmware, for all intents and purposes, is the heart and soul of the device. It's the software, if you will, that runs the device. Just in the embedded world, they call it firmware. So we need to take this firmware image, whether it's developed by you, whether it's developed in-house by your clients, or it's outsourced to another firm. Bottom line is we need to take that firmware image and we need to unpack it. And there are free tools out there available. One is an open source tool called Medmarc that is freely available. Your development team can go out and download it, and it will unpack the firmware image that they have recently created. Once that firmware image is unpacked, the second step is to analyze every executable binary within the file system. And so what this step does is it begins to look for the low-hanging fruit. And what I mean by that are very simple things like insecure coding practices and hidden private crypto keys. Now, I'll show you some examples of what some of these insecure coding practices look like and what I mean by a hidden private crypto key. Some of the stuff will look kind of techy, and it might get a little techy, but don't let it scare you because when you pass these slides along to your development team or whoever it is you have developing your firmware, they'll get it. They'll understand it. But I need you to understand what we're looking at and why what we find is bad. So step 2 is to look for the low-hanging fruit, which I'll give demonstrations and examples here soon. Then the third thing is once you've identified these insecure coding practices or these hidden crypto keys, you need to simply fix it. And they're not hard fixes. If you find a hidden private crypto key in the firmware image, you simply have the development team remove it. It's that simple. Now, the insecure coding practices, what I will show you later is that there are more secure ways to do the same thing. Why companies developers, outsourced developers, are not using these practices is beyond me to explain, but they're very, very prevalent in IoT. These types of insecure coding practices that are discovered, which can be leveraged as attack vectors, have been almost eliminated in desktop applications, mobile apps, but for some odd reason, with the rush to get IoT products out the door, these problems that we thought were solved in the 90s have suddenly reappeared in embedded systems. So unpack the firmware, analyze the executable binaries for insecure coding practices and hidden crypto keys, fix the errors, recompile it, and repeat the process until you have no more vulnerabilities. So some of you may be saying, if you actually have development teams, you may be saying, hey, but my source code is secure. And I would argue, okay, that's fine. Maybe you are using some of the more commercially available tools out there that will audit your code as it's being developed. That's perfectly fine. I have no problem with that. Those tools have their place. Where the problem comes in, for those of you that have any type of programming background will understand this. But when you have your source code and you combine it with other libraries that are pulled down from the internet to help your code run, and maybe you're also integrating a Wi-Fi chipset so your device can be communicated wirelessly from a manufacturer like Broadcom, they will give you not necessarily a piece of code, but they will give you what's called a binary image that you need to now combine with your source code. So you have clean source code. You're very confident because you've used some of the commercially available tools to verify that. Now you're combining your code with stuff from, for example, Broadcom, which you have no access to and no insight to. And then you're compiling it with third-party libraries that you may have downloaded from the internet. When all that is put together, and it's called compiled, when it's all compiled together, who's looking at that final firmware image that represents the code that will go on your device? Your code is clean, but what about that stuff that you just incorporated from a third-party vendor or a third-party library? That's where the vulnerabilities come in. So I know this looks very, very techy, but the point here is that there are tools out there that unpacks, like I said, the firmware image, like Binwalk, that will then allow you to actually examine every line of code in that image, whether it's your code or somebody else's, even though you don't have access to it. That's the beauty of this. Even if you don't have access to that third-party vendor's source code, by reverse engineering that firmware, in this particular example here, we can actually find where an attack vector might reside. Now I know this looks Greek to most of you, but basically what this is telling me is that this particular function call, as what they're known as, takes some random input, and in this case it happens to be a website address. What this tells me is that if I actually put in an address that might be, for example, 500 characters long, which is absurd, it will take that 500 characters, copy it to memory, and then move it to another location which can't possibly accept that many characters, and it creates what's called a buffer overflow. You're basically overflowing the space in memory on the computer or on your embedded device that is supposed to house this particular string. When you have a buffer overflow condition, that could lead to a possible exploitation of that device. So having a tool that can actually pinpoint where these vulnerabilities reside is very critical in identifying how to fix it. And yeah, there I just highlighted the area there that I was just speaking about. Now here's the other thing. Again, this looks like a bunch of gibberish, but what this is, it's actually a private cryptographic key that we found in a firmware image. And you're probably saying, so what? Who cares? Just remove it. Right, it should have been removed from the beginning. So what's the danger of having a private cryptographic key embedded in your firmware image? Well, I'll give you a couple examples. We were actually contracted by an automotive manufacturer who had security concerns about one of their tier 1 suppliers. And their concern was that this device that they were making for the manufacturer allowed their service technicians at the dealerships to plug in this device underneath your dashboard. Everybody has this, what's called an ODB port. It's off to the left underneath the steering wheel. If you look under your car tonight, you'll be able to see it. But there's a port there where they plug this electronic device into. And the goal of this device was to provide the service technicians wireless access to change and read diagnostics from your vehicle. So the automotive manufacturer said, can you verify that this device is actually secure and that it can't be hacked? So they sent us the device, we reverse engineered it, and we found, we found this private crypto key in there. So we basically copied this crypto key out of there. We already had unpacked the firmware, so we had all the code and everything that we needed, and we went in and we actually modified the code. We made it do things it wasn't supposed to do. And then once it was all compiled back together, we signed it with this private crypto key because that's what was required. No changes could be made to that device unless it was signed by the private crypto key of that tier 1 supplier. So we made our little hacker backdoors and made it do things it wasn't supposed to do, compiled it, and when it asked to be signed by that tier 1 supplier, we used their own key and signed it, and then we flashed it back onto the vehicle. So what we were able to demonstrate was that we could make changes, sign it with their own key, and now we could hack the vehicle. Now, we didn't do anything dramatic. It wasn't like the Jeep, driving it off the road remotely. But we demonstrated that, when you turn the turn signal on, you go left, it's actually blinking right. Right is actually blinking left. When you turn the air conditioner on, the heater kicks on. When you turn the air conditioner off, you get the idea. So we were able to find crypto key material that allowed an attacker to make modifications to the firmware and put it right back onto the device. Finding crypto keys is very critical when it comes to identifying attack vectors in a number of these embedded devices. The other thing you need to look for as well is, I mentioned earlier, these third-party libraries that people download from the internet, which helps your code do what it needs to do. Instead of writing all this stuff from scratch, nobody wants to do that. So they just go out to the internet, they find these publicly maintained libraries, and they download them, and they compile them into the firmware image. That's fine. I mean, everybody does that. There's no problem with that. But the problem comes in when you need to verify whether or not that's an unadulterated version of the code that has been put into your firmware. So in this particular case, this particular library here, libcurl, this particular tool that we use basically says we're 100% confident that this hasn't been altered, that this is indeed this particular version, and that it's safe to use, or that it's the version that's off the internet. Now, we actually show some what are called vulnerability announcements, that if you want to click on the vulnerabilities that have been discovered in this, you can read all that stuff here. Now, when you take that, we're absolutely certain that this is the correct library. We do find that even though that we're certain it is the correct library, we do find some security problems with this. In fact, we find 15 of them that happen to be in this particular library. Compare that to this particular library, SSL. Everybody who has used banking online has used SSL in the background, probably haven't even taken notice of it. But and that makes sure that your transactions are encrypted and secure. Well, the confidence rating here isn't that high with this particular library. So that tells us two things. Either it's been altered from its source, or the manufacturer decided to make some modifications to it, which they could possibly have done as well. But looking at the library here, we discover that it's not necessarily the one that's out there on the internet right now. You may want to pay attention to that and have your developers or your outsourced development team take a closer look at that, or at least explain why that doesn't appear to be the library that's out there freely available. And even though that doesn't appear to be the library, we still found that there are some security vulnerabilities here that we've identified, more buffer overflows, just like the previous example I showed. So that is a very high-level, kind of a geeky overview of where these vulnerabilities reside and how sophisticated attackers look for these things. They're looking for those things I just went over, and then developing exploits to take advantage of those holes. And these things they're not that hard to find if you know what you're looking for, and not all developers know how to look for these things. So that's why I'm going to point you to some open source tools and even some commercial tools that you might want to consider incorporating into the development process if you have a development team creating the firmware for your connected medical device. Or you might want to ask, if you happen to have your development outsourced, ask your outsourced development company if they're using any of these tools to verify the security of the firmware that they're developing for your device. So here are what I would recommend as 3 steps to mitigating cybersecurity risks in connected medical devices. This actually would apply to any IoT device, but connected medical devices would fit perfectly in with this as well. And maybe many of you are doing some of these already, which I applaud you if you are. So the first step is to perform a traditional security assessment. Now, there are commercial companies out there that offer this capability, but there are some open source tools out there that if you have a security team or a sophisticated IT staff that has some security expertise, they should be able to use these tools, and many of them will know what these tools are. So the first one is to perform basically a scan on the device when it's connected to a network. So tools such as Nmap, Nessus, and Metasploit can help. Nmap basically looks at the device to see what it's listening for, to see what type of data that it's allowing into the device. Nessus is basically an open source tool that will, once it identifies a device is actually listening for incoming network traffic, Nessus will actually launch attacks against that device, and it will go through whatever it has in its inventory to see if it can actually crash the device. It doesn't try and take it over, but it does try and send it a bunch of data in mail-formed packets and things of that nature to see if it can actually crash the device. And then Metasploit is pretty complex, but it's a little more robust. It's kind of a combination of Nmap and Nessus on steroids is what I would call it. And it would suit you well to see if you could utilize Metasploit against connected medical devices as well to perform that traditional security assessment. Now the second step is to perform a black box test with fuzzing. What the heck does all that mean? Black box testing basically means you give somebody in your company or a third-party company your actual connected medical device and say, we're not going to tell you anything about it. The only information you can get is what's on the internet if there's anything out there. We want to see if you can hack into it. And black box testing is probably one of the better ways to go about testing any type of connected device, because it is more representative of how an attacker would encounter your device. Because me as an attacker, sitting behind my keyboard, all I know is that you're an IP address on a network, and that you're listening for certain types of traffic, and I can connect to you. I don't know if you're an implantable defibrillator. I don't know if you're a set-top box. I don't know if you're an automobile. I don't know what you are. So black box testing assumes we know nothing about the product, and then we begin sending different types of commands and packets and information to the device to see how we can get it to respond and possibly even crash, very similar to like what I mentioned in step 1 with Nessus. Now, there are commercial tools out there that also do this in a more robust fashion. In fact, I listed one here by Codenomicon called Defensics. I don't know how much the tool costs. I just know that it's out there. But so if cost is a consideration, I listed 3 open source tools that would allow you to perform some fuzzing to help you with any black box testing against your connected device. My personal favorite is, of course, step 3, which is a firmware evaluation. That's what we do. We actually look at the firmware. Even if you send us a device, which some companies have, they basically said, hey, we want you to black box test this set-top box or this particular piece of gear. Normally what we'll do is, in addition to that, is that once we have the device up and running, we'll actually take it apart. And once we have it apart, we'll extract the firmware from running memory. And then we'll use open source tools like I mentioned earlier, Medmarc and some of these others here, to actually begin the reverse engineering process to look for those vulnerabilities that I outlined a few slides ago. And then the commercial tool, which automates a lot of this, is the tool that we create called Centrifuge that automates the reverse engineering of firmware. But even if you do get a commercial tool, whether it's ours or somebody else's, you still have to concern yourself with false positives. You still need someone to actually manually look at what's discovered and make sure that it's truly a vulnerability. Because one thing I tell people all the time is, just because a device may have some vulnerabilities, it does not necessarily mean those vulnerabilities are exploitable. So you can live with some vulnerabilities, but if the vulnerabilities can be exploited by an outside source, those are the ones you need to concern yourself with. So those are the 3 things I would recommend any connected medical device manufacturer to look at. Traditional penetration testing of the device when it's connected up to the network. Give it to either a third party or an internal Tiger team to do some black box testing via fuzzing. And then finally, download the open source tool Medmarc and have your team or another party actually reverse engineer and evaluate the firmware. So that's pretty much my spiel on connected medical devices and how we go about finding them, how I suggest fixing them, and the 3 things that you can do as you start to look at integrating the firmware into your final product. If you take these steps into account, you will significantly reduce the attack vector that criminals and other cyber miscreants will try and exploit your device. And remember, like I said, they're not looking to take over your device. They're looking to use your device as a hopping point, as a stepping stone in a much broader attack. So what I want to quickly do is give you a little bit background on who we are and what we do. The company's 10 years old. We're a small company of 12 people. We're all former U.S. National Security Agency offensive cyber ops. So we were attacking and putting in backdoors in IoT devices in foreign governments before IoT was called IoT. So I founded the company, worked in computer network exploitation, primarily with a wireless focus. My co-founder and CTO, also from the NSA, worked very closely with SOCOM and special mission units that actually had to go overseas during the Iraq War and actually get into some of these IoT devices that have been found over in the theater. So our firmware evaluation team, of course, is the rest of the 10 employees, and they all come from the NSA, and we're all specialized in computer network exploitation and reverse engineering firmware. Our customers, of course, we still have some military customers, but we also are starting to get bigger clientele from Fortune 500. Of course, some of these names you recognize, and we're dealing now with AT&T and Verizon and Google and even some of the security companies out there like Mandiant, FireEye. There's my contact information. And if you guys ever just want to, ask me some questions, shoot me an email, give me a call. I'm open to helping you guys out. I think, I want to start using our skill set, our knowledge, and our capabilities to start helping commercial customers instead of just helping the intelligence community do these things. So feel free to contact me anytime. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and throw it back to Courtney. And if you guys have any questions, fire them away, and I'll do the best I can to answer them.
All right, thanks, Terry. Looks like we've got a couple questions in. So we'll now begin the Q&A session. If you have a question, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A panel located at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your questions in the space at the bottom, hit the send button. Please be sure to direct your questions to all panelists in the Ask menu, and no one else will be able to see your questions but the panelists. So first question here, Terry. We use a consulting firm to conduct black box testing on our connected devices. Is that enough?
In most cases, I would say yes, but I would also encourage you to have that company see if they have the capability and the skill set to reverse engineer the firmware, because black box testing is only going to see if sending the device mail form data will crash it. That's all it will do. It won't tell you where the crash took place or how the crash took place. It will basically say, hey, if I send a mail form packet with extra data or maybe some Unicode characters in there that it wasn't expecting, we can actually cause the device to stop working. That's severe enough. But to go further, I would actually dig into the firmware itself, because it's the firmware, when we do that binary analysis that I spoke about with all the Greek coding stuff that probably looked very unfamiliar to you. Once we can identify via those methods those insecure coding practices, it should alleviate that crashing during any black box testing. So black box testing will only get you so far. I would still encourage you to reverse engineer and examine the firmware.
Okay, another question. In your example where you could alter the vehicle using crypto keys, how do the crypto keys get there in the first place?
That's interesting. The developers actually put them in there for whatever reason. Now, the only thing that I can think of, and we've noticed this with hard-coded usernames and passwords that we also find, is that the reason these things are usually left in there, and they're in there by accident, is during the testing phase of the firmware and the device. So, for example, the crypto keys, I really can't give you a great example why the key is in there, but the hard-coded usernames and passwords, it's usually a short username, a short password that a developer will put in there so they don't always have to type in a real username and a real long password to test the software during their software development lifecycle. And it's oversight. I mean, if they had simple checklists that went through and basically said, step 1, remove all hard-coded usernames and passwords. Step 2, remove all private crypto keys prior to compilation. If those checklists exist and people followed those, we wouldn't see these private crypto keys in there in the first place. Hopefully that answered the question. Great.
Yeah, I think so. So what's the biggest threat you see besides bad coding practices and these left-behind crypto keys?
I think the biggest threat, and this could apply to outsourced development of connected medical devices. We've seen this with British Telecom, which is a large telecom provider over in the UK. They actually had their Wi-Fi routers. Everybody on this call I know has some type of router or Wi-Fi router their cable or their telecom provider gave them to put into their home so they can have internet access. What we found over in the UK is that they never developed their own devices that they provide customers for internet access. They actually had them outsourced to Huawei over in China. And what we discovered during an assessment was that there was a purposely left-in back door by Huawei into British Telecom's what they called the BT Home Hub. So once we discovered that and pointed that out to them, they were, of course, shocked, and then they went back to the vendor and said, look, we found a hard-coded username, password, backdoor in the device. Can you please remove it? So they actually removed it, but when we looked again, what we discovered was that not only was it gone, but it was simply moved to another location in the code. So they complied with the request to remove the backdoor, but they simply put it someplace else in the firmware image, which would have given Huawei access to all the British Telecom customers. Once we pointed that out to them, I don't know if they ended up terminating the agreement or what actions they took, but that is something that we see when firmware development is outsourced. Depending on who that vendor is, they could potentially be putting in backdoors so they can access those devices for whatever reason at some point in the future.
Okay, looks like we've got two more here. Are R&D, research and development companies, vulnerable during clinical trials? And could you think of an example?
I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but if R&D companies are not using, now again, whether you're having any of the firmware developed in-house or outsourced, if secure coding practices have not been mandated from the beginning, there could be potential attack vectors in those devices even while they're in clinical trials. So if I understood the question correctly, yes, there still could be vulnerabilities. Now, if you're an R&D company and whether you're developing the code in-house or outsourcing it, I would make sure that there is a requirement to implement secure coding practices from the beginning. And hopefully there are tools, they're using tools like Veracode, Synopsys, Codenomicon, HP Fortify to actually check for the developers using secure code. And remember the example I gave earlier. Just because your people or your outsourced team created secure code, how secure is that system overall once you start compiling in those third-party libraries, or maybe a third-party device driver? So let's say you're St. Jude, and I don't mean to keep picking on St. Jude, but they're high profile and they're a great example. So let's say you're a St. Jude and you're developing a new device that talks wirelessly to some type of monitoring unit, whether the device is implantable or not, it doesn't matter. So you have to develop the firmware to not only run your device, but now you also have to decide during the development process, who am I going to get to supply my Wi-Fi chip that goes into this device? Is it going to be Broadcom? Is it going to be Atmel? Is it going to be somebody else? Whoever that is, they're not going to give you the source code to run that chip, that Wi-Fi chip that you're putting into your device. They're going to give you a binary image, and you cannot see into that unless you reverse engineer that firmware. So we've had companies come to us, largely telecom companies, who are getting ready to take delivery of these types of connected wireless devices from manufacturers that they have no insight into the security of those suppliers and want to know, is the code they're giving me that I'm using, is it secure? So their code and your code might be secure. What about the stuff that your chip integrator is sending you to integrate into your connected medical device? How secure is that? That's a possible attack vector too, and the only way you'll know is by reverse engineering the firmware.
Great. Okay, and I think you may have just partially answered this, but looks like the last question here. This person says, our development team uses source code auditing tools now. How do you differ?
Yeah, like I said, the source code auditing tools, we do not compete with them. Veracode, Synopsys, HP Fortify, use them. I encourage you. I have no vested interest in financial gain. If you work with those companies, that's fine. So those, as you develop code, those are going to check your code in real time to make sure you are using secure coding practices. So when you get the big green check mark and the big thumbs up that your code is secure, my concern is, and we've been able to demonstrate this time and time again, you take your clean code, and during the compilation process, when you're making that firmware image, when you're compiling it or connecting it to those third-party libraries and those device drivers from Broadcom or whoever your Wi-Fi chip manufacturer, for example, might be, who's looking at that at the end? Those tools don't look at that. They only look at your code. They don't look at the final product. We look at the final product just before it goes to production. And that way, while your code is clean, if we find a vulnerability somewhere in the firmware image, chances are it's either from the libraries that you've compiled in or it's from your supplier who gave you a device driver, for example, to use in your connected medical device.
Okay, great. I think we're just about out of time here. Thank you so much, Terry. You're really able to cover this issue that I know is very important and still somewhat unfamiliar to a lot of life sciences companies.